Taking a deep breath, he rang the doorbell. The sound was barely audible over the howling wind. No response. He pressed the bell again, and this time, the faint sound of music playing somewhere deep inside the house reached his ears. It was an old tune, something melancholic and distant. "Pizza delivery for Mr. Cartwright," he called out, unsure why he used the name of the long-gone owner. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark, dusty interior of the mansion. Jake's skin crawled, but he stepped inside, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the professional obligation to deliver the pizza wherever it was requested. "Hello? Anyone here?" His voice echoed through the halls, met only by silence. Then, upstairs, a door slammed. The sudden sound made him jump, and the pizza box nearly slipped from his hands. Swallowing his fear, Jake decided to leave the pizza in the foyer and return to his car. He set the box down on a dusty table and turned to leave, but a voice stopped him. "Won't you stay for a slice?" The voice was whispery, almost lost beneath the continuing soft play of music. Jake spun around. In the dim light, he could see the figure of a man descending the staircase. The man was dressed in outdated clothing, his face obscured by shadows. Instinct screamed at Jake to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Who are you?" Jake managed to stammer. "The owner of the house," the man replied, his voice echoing oddly, as if not entirely present. "And you brought dinner. How thoughtful." As the man reached the last step, the light from outside briefly illuminated his face. It was gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through Jake. Panic surged through him, and he finally found the strength to turn and rush to the door. But it wouldn't budge. Turning back toward the man, Jake saw him now only a few feet away, the air around him shimmering strangely. "What do you want from me?" Jake gasped, his back against the unyielding door. "Just company," the man said, his voice a mixture of loneliness and an eerie calmness. "It's been so long since anyone visited. Stay, listen to some music, have a slice of pizza." The suggestion, under different circumstances, might have seemed friendly, even normal. But here, in the darkness of the old Cartwright place, with the man's ghostly presence and the inexplicable music still playing softly from above, it was terrifying. As Jake stood frozen, the floorboards upstairs creaked, and a shadow seemed to pass by the top of the stairs. Their house was waking up, stirring with a life of its own. He knew he had to escape, to get out before he became just another ghost story of Hollow Creek. With a desperate effort, Jake slammed his shoulder against the door. It groaned but held fast. The man was closer now, almost within reach, his eyes gleaming with a desperate hunger. Jake pushed against the door again, feeling the old would start to give way under his panic-fueled strength. He glanced back at the man, who was now just inches away, reaching out with hands that seemed too real to belong to a ghost. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging as he braced for one more desperate push against the door. Just as the man's fingers brushed against his arm, cold and surprisingly solid, the wood finally splintered with a loud crack, and the door flew open. Jake stumbled out into the night, the chill of the air hitting him like a wave. He didn't look back as he sprinted down the path, through the gate, and back to his car. Once inside, he locked the doors, his breath fogging up the windows as he tried to calm his racing heart. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered to life on the first try, a small mercy in the midst of his terror. As he drove away, the house receded into the background, becoming once again just part of the landscape of Hollow Creek, silent and dark. But as Jake drove, the peace he expected to feel didn't come. Instead, a creeping dread settled over him. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man from the house sitting in the back seat, or perhaps running after the car. But there was nothing, only the empty road and the night. When Jake finally returned to Freddy's Famous Pies, the place was closing up for the night. He was pale, his hands still shaking as he recounted the story to his disbelieving co-workers. They listened, wide-eyed, as he told them about the mysterious man and the self-opening door. "Man, you gotta be kidding," said one of them, laughing nervously. "That place has been empty for years." But the manager, an older woman who had lived in Hollow Creek her whole life, didn't laugh. Instead, she looked thoughtful, her eyes troubled. "You might have met Edward Cartwright himself," she said quietly, making everyone's blood run cold. "He disappeared back in '58, and they say he never left his home. Guess he really hasn't." The next few days were uneventful, but the encounter left a mark on Jake. He jumped at shadows and the slightest unexpected noise made him flinch. His friends noticed the change, and although they tried to make light of it, to reassure him, the fear was palpable. Then, several nights later, while closing up alone, Jake heard it, the same melancholic tune that had been playing in the old Cartwright place. It was faint, barely more than a whisper of sound, but unmistakably the same melody. His heart froze. He was alone in the pizzeria, the last to leave. The doors were locked, the windows closed. Yet the music played, seeping into the room like a cold mist. He searched for the source, flipping on lights, opening doors to empty rooms, but found nothing that could be making the sound. Finally, standing in the middle of the kitchen, the music grew louder, as though it were coming from right beneath his feet. Panicked, he called the manager, who came quickly. By the time she arrived, however, the music had stopped. Jake was shaking, pale as a ghost, standing in the silent kitchen. "This place is old, maybe there's an old music box or something stuck in a crawl space," the manager suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. They searched together but found nothing. No box, no logical source for the music. Jake went home that night feeling unsettled. The music haunted him, playing over and over in his head. He barely slept, and when he did, he dreamt of the old Cartwright place, of doors that locked themselves, of cold hands reaching out from the shadows. The next day, Jake's fears were realized when he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of his car. It was old, yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant but faded. "Come back, Jake. The house is lonely without you." No one at Freddy's could explain it. The note looked decades old, like something straight out of the 1950s. But the message was clear and unmistakably meant for him. Shaken, Jake decided he had to find out once and for all what was happening. He needed answers, or he would never find peace. That night, against the advice of his friends and manager, Jake drove back to the old Cartwright place. The fog was thick, cloaking the world in a heavy, oppressive blanket. As he approached the mansion, the air turned cold, the atmosphere charged with an electric tension. He parked in front of the gate, the mansion looming ominously ahead. Their house seemed to be waiting for him, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching his approach. With every step towards the door, his heart beat louder, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. As he reached the front door, it swung open silently, inviting him back into the darkness. The melody, that melancholic tune, drifted out, wrapping around him like a chilling embrace. Jake hesitated, every instinct screaming for him to turn and flee, but curiosity and an overwhelming need for answers propelled him forward into the shadowy foyer. The door shut behind him with a definitive thud, the sound echoing through the empty halls of the mansion. The music led him deeper into the house, its source still unseen, guiding him like a siren song through the corridors draped in veils of dust and time. As he ventured further, Jake's flashlight beam danced across faded portraits of the Cartwright family, their eyes seeming to follow his every move, whispering silent judgments. The air grew colder with each step, the weight of the unseen eyes and the haunting melody building a crescendo of dread that pulsed in rhythm with his quickening heartbeat. Reaching the grand staircase, he paused, the music drawing him upwards. Each step creaked under his weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the encompassing silence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before him, a narrow path flanked by closed doors. The melody was louder now, more insistent, coming from a room at the far end. As he approached, the door to the room slowly opened, revealing a space that seemed untouched by time. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was free of dust and decay. A grand piano sat in the center, its keys moving softly of their own accord, the melancholic tune spilling into the air with ghostly grace. Jake stepped inside, the door closing silently behind him. The air inside the room was unnaturally still, as if sealed away from the rest of the world. Drawn to the piano, he watched the keys to press smoothly, no hand guiding them, the melody weaving its way around him, seeping into his pores, cold and sweet. "Who are you?" Jake whispered into the quiet, his voice barely more than a breath. "Welcome back, Jake," a voice replied, not through words, but as a whisper within the music, its tones clear and chilling. "You've returned, just as we hoped." The temperature dropped further, breath visible in the air, as shadows began to coalesce in the corners of the room. They moved with purpose, drifting towards him, their forms vague and shifting. Jake felt a pressure in his chest, a tightening grip that threatened to suffocate him with fear. "Why am I here? What do you want from me?" Jake managed to choke out, his back edging towards the wall, the only solid thing he could find. "To play our song," the voice sang through the melody, the piano's keys moving faster now. "To stay and be part of our symphony." The shadows edged closer, their forms becoming more distinct, more terrifying. Faces appeared within the mist, eyes hollow, mouths agape, as if frozen in a silent scream. They were the lost souls of the Cartwright family, bound to the mansion, their presence tied to the haunting melody that now filled the room with its overwhelming sadness. Jake realized that the music wasn't just a song, it was a binding spell, a collection of souls caught in a perpetual loop of their last moments. And now, they wanted him to join them, to ensure their melody never ended. Panic set in, his survival instincts overtaking his frozen fascination. He scrambled for the door, his hand slipping on the cold knob that wouldn't turn. Turning back to the piano, he made a desperate decision. He rushed to the instrument, his hand slamming down on the keys, disrupting the melody with a harsh dissonance. The reaction was immediate. The room shook, the spirits wailing in anger and despair, their forms blurring into violent shadows that thrashed around him. But the melody was broken, the spell momentarily disturbed. Seizing the moment, Jake threw himself against the door. It burst open, the mansion seeming to scream in protest. He didn't look back as he fled down the hallway, the wails of the Cartwright spirits echoing behind him, a tumultuous cacophony that filled the oppressive air of the mansion. He burst out into the night, the cool air a harsh contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. His car was where he had left it, the only beacon of the modern world in the nightmarish landscape he had escaped. As he drove away, the mansion faded into the background, its melody still playing in his mind, a haunting reminder that his escape was temporary. The road unwound before him, leading back to the safety of the town, but Jake knew that the story wasn't over. The spirits had tasted his fear, they had seen his face. And the melody, now disrupted, would seek him out, yearning to be whole again. As he drove, the shadows seemed to linger on the edge of his vision, the night whispering with voices not quite human, a symphony of horrors that was far from finished. As Jake drove through the night, his heart still racing from the terror of the old Cartwright place, he couldn't shake the eerie melody that clung to his mind like a persistent echo. Every shadow cast by the trees along the roadside seemed to move with a sinister intent, and the occasional flicker of his headlights brought him brief moments of panic, fearing what they might reveal. Upon reaching his apartment, Jake was hesitant to leave the safety of his car. The familiar surroundings of his neighborhood felt alien, tainted by the night's events. Eventually, he mustered enough courage to go inside, locking and relocking his door, checking each window to ensure it was securely fastened. The silence of his apartment was suffocating. He turned on every light, filled the space with noise from the television, anything to drown out the haunting melody still playing in his head. But the shadows in the corners of his rooms seemed darker, the spaces between the furniture too deep, too inviting for things unseen. Unable to sleep and unwilling to surrender to the terror, Jake sat on his couch, eyes wide open, scanning the room relentlessly. As the hours ticked by, his fatigue grew, but every time he felt himself drifting off, a sharp fear would jolt him awake, fear of what might be waiting in his dreams. When dawn finally broke, it brought no relief. The daylight seemed unnatural, as if the sun was too dim, its light unable to fully penetrate the gloom that had settled inside his apartment. Jake's mind felt foggy, his thoughts consumed by the eerie occurrences of the previous night. The feeling of being watched had not diminished, and now, the air in his apartment felt thick, as if charged with an impending storm. Determined to seek answers, or at least some form of relief, Jake decided to visit a local psychic known for her expertise in spiritual matters and hauntings. The small shop, nestled between an old bookstore and a closed-down bakery, had always seemed like a curiosity rather than a place of answers, but now it represented a beacon of hope. The psychic, a woman named Marla with striking violet eyes, listened intently as Jake recounted his experiences. Her face, usually calm and unreadable, grew increasingly concerned as he spoke of the melody and the spirits of the Cartwright family. "This is no ordinary haunting," Marla said after a moment of silence. "What you've encountered is a soul trap, a spiritual vortex that's been set into motion by a powerful emotional event. And it seems to have attached itself to you." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "How do I get rid of it?" Marla hesitated, her eyes piercing. "It's difficult. This type of entity feeds on fear and uses your own energy against you. We need to break the cycle, disrupt the melody that binds the spirits to you." She explained that they would attempt a cleansing ritual to shield him and try to sever his connection to the haunting melody. Jake was skeptical but desperate. They set up in the back room of her shop, surrounded by candles and incense, the air thick with the scent of sage. Marla began chanting, her voice a soft but forceful incantation that filled the room. Jake closed his eyes, trying to focus on her words, but the melody in his head grew louder, drowning out her voice. The shadows around them seemed to pulse with life, growing denser, more aggressive. As the ritual reached its peak, Jake felt a sudden surge of coldness envelop him, as if ice water had been poured down his back. He opened his eyes to see the shadows swirling around them, the candles flickering wildly. Marla's voice became a shout, her words slicing through the chaos. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room went still. The candles steadied, the incense smoke rising in a straight column. Marla slumped back, exhausted but triumphant. "It's done," she breathed heavily. "The link is severed. But be warned, the spirits may not give up so easily. You must remain vigilant, protect your spirit, and avoid giving in to fear." Jake left Marla's shop feeling a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The melody had quieted, reduced to a faint whisper that he could almost ignore. But the world still seemed shadowed, as if he was seeing it through a dark veil. As he returned to his daily life, trying to put the horrors behind him, the sense of being watched gradually faded, replaced by an uneasy peace. But the shadows never fully receded, always lurking just at the edge of his vision, a constant reminder of the darkness that he had escaped, and that might still be waiting for its moment to return. Despite the semblance of normalcy, Jake found himself perpetually on edge, the slightest sound or shift in light sending his heart racing. His once mundane routine now carried an undercurrent of fear, transforming his everyday life into a nerve-wracking ordeal. He avoided the darkness, the solitude, and anything that could remind him of that haunting melody and the terrifying night at the old Cartwright place. However, Jake's efforts to return to a normal life were continuously thwarted. It started subtly, objects in his apartment slightly moved, not enough to be sure it wasn't his own forgetfulness, but just enough to keep him uneasy. Then came the whispers. At first, he thought they were echoes of his own thoughts, a mind strained by stress and lack of sleep. But as days passed, the whispers grew clearer, as though someone was always just behind him, just out of sight. One evening, while trying to unwind with a book, Jake distinctly heard his name being whispered. The sound was so real, so close, he spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind him. But there was nothing, only the chilling realization that the encounter at the mansion had left a deeper mark on his life than he had feared. The whispers didn't cease, they became a constant presence, murmuring unintelligible secrets into the air around him, especially at night. Sleep became elusive, a nightly battle against the fear that something would reach out from the shadows and drag him back to that dark, melody-filled room in the Cartwright mansion. One night, plagued by insomnia, Jake noticed a faint glow emanating from the living room of his apartment. Cautious but driven by a desperate need for answers, he crept towards the source of the light. There, on his coffee table, lay the photograph he had taken of the Cartwright mansion the evening he delivered the pizza, a photograph he didn't remember placing there. As he watched, the image seemed to pulse with a soft light, shadows playing across the surface as if reflecting moonlight through the mansion's broken windows. Mesmerized, Jake reached out to touch the photograph, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface, the room around him dimmed, swallowed by darkness, and the air filled with that all-too-familiar melancholic melody. Panicking, Jake tried to pull away, but the photograph held him, a cold energy snaking up his arm, paralyzing him. The shadows in the photograph grew, expanding beyond the confines of the paper, enveloping him, pulling him in. The whispers turned to urgent, clamoring voices, a cacophony of desperation and madness that filled his mind. Just as he felt he would be consumed entirely, a loud knock at his door jolted him back to reality. The photograph fell from his hand, the melody ceased abruptly, and the room brightened. Trembling, Jake went to the door, peeking through the peephole. Standing in the hallway was Marla, the psychic, her face etched with concern. Opening the door, Jake barely managed to greet her before she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, landing on the photograph on the floor. "I felt it," Marla said, her voice urgent. A surge of dark energy. "It's getting stronger, Jake. Whatever you did at the mansion, it wasn't enough. The spirits are not just bound to the house, they are bound to you now." "But how?" Jake's voice was a mix of fear and frustration. "I didn't do anything." Marla sighed, her expression grave. "These spirits, they latch onto someone they perceive as a conduit, someone who can hear them. When you disrupted the melody, you made yourself known. You showed them you can interact with their world. And now, they won't let you go easily. What do I do?" Jake felt desperation rising, a tide threatening to overwhelm him. "We need to go back," Marla stated flatly. "Back to the Cartwright mansion. We need to find the source of the haunting, the original score of that melody, and destroy it." Jake felt a chill at the thought of returning to that place, but he knew Marla was right. Their hauntings would not cease on their own, the spirits would not simply drift away. They were tied to him, and he to them, in a melody of darkness that only he could end. Preparations began that night. Jake and Marla gathered what was needed to face the spirits, to break the cycle of haunting that had enveloped his life. As they worked, the shadows watched, the whispers murmured, and the melody, though silent, hung heavy in the air, a foreboding prelude to the confrontation that awaited them at the heart of the darkness in the old Cartwright place. Jake and Marla spent the following days gathering every necessary artifact and piece of occult knowledge Marla thought they might need to sever the bond between Jake and the haunting spirits of the Cartwright mansion. Among these were ancient texts, sage for smudging, holy water, and a crucifix that had been blessed by 3 different denominations of the Christian faith. Marla even procured an old violin, explaining that music might also serve as a bridge in the ritual, either to strengthen their own defenses or to disrupt the spectral melody further. The night they chose to return was unusually clear, the moon hanging full and ominous in the sky, casting long, deep shadows across the ground. As they approached the mansion, the familiar chill of unseen eyes watching them made Jake's skin crawl. The building loomed like a malevolent sentinel, its darkened windows and dilapidated structure more menacing under the moonlight. Armed with their tools and fortified by a protective circle of salt, Jake and Marla entered the mansion. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the scent of decay and the lingering presence of the past. They made their way to the room with the grand piano, the site of Jake's last terrifying encounter. The door creaked open with an echoing moan, as if the house itself were weary or perhaps wary of their intentions. Marla set up their equipment methodically, placing candles at strategic points around the room and lighting them, their flames flickering as if reluctant to burn in such an oppressive atmosphere. She then drew a circle around them with salt and instructed Jake to sit within it, the old violin resting across his knees. Just as the piano played on its own, Marla whispered, her voice barely audible over the thick silence, "You must try to use this violin to disrupt whatever energy remains tied to this place. Break their control over the melody." Jake nodded, his hands trembling as he took up the violin and bow. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The sound was discordant at first, untrained fingers fumbling over the strings, but slowly, a melody began to form, one that rose above the oppressive silence of the mansion. As he played, the air around them began to stir, a wind that seemed to emanate from nowhere, swirling around the room, lifting dust and old leaves in a spectral dance. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, forms and faces that seemed both curious and enraged by the intrusion. Marla began to chant, her words strong and clear, echoing around the room, blending with the music from Jake's violin. The temperature dropped suddenly, breaths visible in the air, and a low moan filled the house, a sound of deep, ancient sorrow. The climax of their ritual approached as Jake's music became more frantic, his body moving with a desperate energy. Marla's voice raised in volume, her incantations becoming commands, demanding release and peace for the spirits bound to the house. Then, all at once, a silence fell. The wind died, the candles flickered one last time and then steadied. Jake's final note hung in the air, trembling like a living thing before fading into the stillness. They waited, breaths held, unsure if their efforts had been enough. Minutes passed, heavy with expectation. Then, gradually, a sense of peace began to fill the room, the oppressive weight of the air lifting, the shadows receding like a tide going out. A soft light seemed to filter through the windows, not from the moon, but as if the house itself were sighing in relief. Marla finally broke the silence. "It's done," she said, her voice exhausted but hopeful. "The spirits are free. The bond is broken." Jake lowered the violin, his arms weak but his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. They packed up their equipment and left the mansion, the door closing softly behind them, a quiet end to the night of confrontation. As they walked back to the car, the mansion behind them stood quiet and serene against the night sky, no longer a place of dread but just an old, empty building, its ghosts finally at rest. Driving away, Jake felt a profound sense of closure. He had faced his fears, stood against forces he once couldn't have imagined, and come through it changed but intact. The road ahead was still uncertain, life always was, but he knew now that whatever shadows might fall across his path, there was always a way through the darkness. As the first light of dawn began to touch their horizon, it found Jake not just a survivor, but a victor, the melodies of darkness replaced by a song of hope. As Jake drove away from the old Cartwright place for the last time, the first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of gold and pink. The mansion, once a malevolent presence in his life, now appeared just a mere silhouette against the morning light, its power diminished, its haunting melodies silenced. In the weeks that followed, Jake found himself gradually reclaiming the peace he had lost. The whispers and shadows that had once filled his nights dissipated, leaving behind only the quiet solitude of his apartment. He returned to work at Freddy's Famous Pies, where his co-workers noticed a change in him, not just a return to his old self, but an added layer of depth, a resilience that hadn't been there before. Marler, the psychic who had helped guide him through the darkness, became a good friend and a mentor. Together, they shared stories of other hauntings and supernatural events, but none so personal or intense as what Jake had experienced at the Cartwright mansion. He learned much from her about the spiritual world, knowledge that he used to help others who came to him with their own ghostly troubles, earning a reputation as someone who could face the paranormal with courage and empathy. Months turned into a year, and the memories of that night at the mansion began to feel more like a distant dream. Yet, every year on the anniversary of that fateful delivery, Jake found himself driving out to the edge of town, where he could see the old mansion standing quietly in the distance. It was a ritual, a way to remind himself of the night he faced his deepest fears and came out stronger. On one such visit, as he stood looking at the mansion bathed in the soft light of dusk, Jake felt a gentle breeze pass by, carrying with it a faint whisper of music, so faint he might have imagined it. A smile touched his lips, not one of fear but of acknowledgement. He knew the spirits were at rest, but he also knew that places like the Cartwright mansion never truly lose their magic, their mystery. Turning to leave, Jake took one last look at the mansion. It stood as a testament to the past, a symbol of his journey through darkness into light. As he walked back to his car, the faint melody mingled with the rustling leaves, a soft, melancholic tune that no longer held any power over him. It was now just a piece of the mansion's long history, a whisper from the past that no longer called to him from the shadows. Driving back to town, Jake felt a sense of closure, a profound peace with the knowledge that some mysteries remain just that, mysteries to be acknowledged, respected, and, when necessary, confronted. The road ahead was clear, lit by the last light of the day, leading him not just towards home, but towards whatever new adventures awaited him in the light and shadows of his life. The story of Jake and the old Cartwright place became a quiet legend in Hollow Creek, a tale to be told on stormy nights when the wind howled just right, reminding everyone that even in the darkest of times, there is light waiting to break through. Jake's story was not just one of horror, but of triumph, a reminder that courage and a willing heart can overcome the darkest of melodies.